The morphine syringe hit the dirt before anyone could catch it. Staff Sergeant Dillon Marsh watched it roll under the canvas flap of the medical tent and disappear, and he did not move to retrieve it. He was 63 years old, lean as a fence post, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something quarried rather than born. His hands rested flat on the folding table in front of him. Around those hands lay the contents of a combat medical kit: tourniquet, pressure bandage, nasopharyngeal airway, trauma shears, all of it arranged with the kind of quiet precision that doesn't come from a checklist. The kind that comes from doing the same thing in the dark, in the mud, in the noise, until the hands know the order before the mind does. Nobody in the tent was looking at the kit. They were looking at him. 12 candidates for the Joint Special Operations Medical Course stood in a loose half-circle, most of them young enough to be his grandchildren. Behind them, a facilitator from SOCOM named Captain Reardon, 31 years old, 2 combat deployments, chin like a hood ornament, stood with a tablet in his hand and a look on his face that said he had already made his assessment. "This is the practical assessment phase," Reardon said, not looking up from the tablet. "Simulated mass casualty, 4 patients. Each presents with a different penetrating trauma. You treat in order of survivability, you prioritize correctly, you use correct technique. Timer runs. Fastest correct treatment sequence wins the evaluation slot." He finally looked up, looked at Marsh. "All candidates participate." One of the young ones, broad shoulders, a tribal sleeve tattoo showing below his rolled cuff, the kind of guy who posts his deadlift numbers, leaned toward the man beside him and said something under his breath. A short laugh followed. Marsh heard it. He always heard it. He didn't look over. Reardon clicked his tablet. "You have 90 seconds to review your patient manifest before the scenario begins." Marsh picked up the manifest. He read it once, set it face down on the table. That was the first thing that made them stop talking, briefly. Nobody else had set theirs down yet. The candidates around him were still scanning, lips moving, some underlining with a thumbnail. The man with the tattoo, his name tape said Corley, glanced at Marsh, setting down the manifest, and made a sound, somewhere between amusement and contempt. "Memorized it already, old-timer?" Marsh looked at him then. Steady. No expression at all. "Read it once." Corley shook his head. Looked away. "Cool." The tent smelled of latex gloves and new nylon, and the particular synthetic odor of simulation blood. A thick red dye compound designed to stain uniforms for realism and accountability. Outside, somewhere past the wire, the Colorado high desert sat baking at 94 degrees. The elevation here was just under 8,000 feet. A few of the candidates had taken an extra breath when they arrived. Marsh had not. He had done his preparation already. He had done it the night before, alone in his bunk, which nobody knew because nobody had thought to ask what he did at night. He had closed his eyes and walked the sequence. Airway, breathing, circulation. Every step a muscle memory laid down across 4 decades. He hadn't needed the 90 seconds. He had needed it done right once, and then done again in worse conditions than this, until it was in the bones and not just in the brain. He had first learned that difference in a place called Landing Zone Albany, in the Ia Drang Valley, in November of 1965. He had been 19 years old, and he had treated 11 men in 47 minutes with a kit that would make these candidates laugh. No hemostatic gauze, no chest seals, no surgical airways, a tourniquet made from a rifle sling. A chest wound packed with the only thing available. He had kept 8 of those 11 alive long enough for the medevac. The other 3, he still knew their names. He recited them some nights the way other men said grace, but nobody here knew that. To Reardon's tablet, Marsh was a retired 18D, Special Forces medical sergeant, brought in as an observer and auxiliary evaluator, a formality, a box checked, something the Army does with old soldiers to make them feel useful while the real work goes on around them. Captain Reardon's voice cut through the tent. Scenario begins in 30 seconds. Patients are staged. This is timed. Go when I say go. The candidates moved into position. Marsh moved with them, and the way he moved was the first thing that felt different. No urgency in the step, but an economy. Each movement arriving exactly where it needed to arrive, nothing wasted, nothing extra. The candidates around him were running. Marsh walked. And somehow he arrived at his first patient at the same time as the others. Go. The stopwatch clicked. Patient 1. Simulated sucking chest wound, right side, tension pneumothorax developing. The dummy had been rigged with a pneumatic mechanism that simulated the sucking sound, a low, rhythmic wheeze that would make a younger medic's stomach drop. Marsh heard it, and his hands were already moving. Gloves on, chest exposed, site identified. He placed the chest seal over the wound with both palms, pressing from the center outward, and then he was already reaching for the decompression needle, finding the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line by feel, not by sight, because in the field, your eyes cannot always be where your hands are. The needle went in. 5 seconds. Seal placed, needle decompressed. Marsh was already moving. Across the tent, Corley was still working his first patient. His technique was correct. Marsh could see that from the corner of his eye. But it was deliberate in the wrong way. Deliberate with the effort of recalling, not the ease of knowing. His hands knew the steps, but they had to ask permission before each one. That lag, small as it was, added up. Patient 2, femoral bleed, left thigh, arterial. The simulation mannequin had a pressurized bladder that pumped stage blood at a rate calibrated to represent arterial hemorrhage. Real arterial blood moves fast. It moves faster than most people expect the first time they see it, which is why most people hesitate. Marsh did not hesitate. The tourniquet was out before he reached the patient, already in his left hand, routed through the buckle. He applied it 4 inches proximal to the wound. One hand braced the limb, the other hand ratcheted the windlass. 3 turns, no gap between skin and fabric. He marked the time of application on the tourniquet strap with the Sharpie he had clipped to his sleeve, a habit from a jungle 58 years ago when no one thought to tell you to mark the time, and a man nearly lost a leg because no one knew how long the tourniquet had been on. He tagged patient 2 and moved. Behind him, he heard a candidate call out, "Tourniquet applied," to a proctor, and the proctor reply, "Check your placement," which meant the candidate had placed it wrong. Marsh didn't look back. He had 3 more patients, and the clock was moving. The third patient stopped him for 2 full seconds. The simulation presented an airway obstruction with altered consciousness, jaw clenching, which made the standard jaw thrust insufficient. It was not on the manifest as written. Someone had added a complication. Marsh registered this in the way a ship registers a change in wind, a small internal recalibration, the course adjusted without drama. He rolled the patient, checked the mouth by feel, found the simulated obstruction, a soft rubber plug placed between the molars, and cleared it with a hooked finger before inserting the nasopharyngeal airway at the correct angle, beveled toward the septum. With a thin layer of the lubricant he kept tucked in the left inner pocket of his kit, not the right, because 40 years of habit had made him reach left without thinking. Airway open. He heard from somewhere across the tent one of the other candidates call out, "Patient 3 airway, I need a NPA." A pause. "Where's the lubricant?" Another pause. The sound of a kit being unzipped a second time, the seconds accumulating. Patient 4 lay at the far end of the tent. This was the one Marsh had thought about the night before, because the manifest described it in terms that were almost deliberately vague. Patient presence with signs of shock, penetrating abdominal trauma. In a trauma scenario, shock with abdominal injury means one thing: internal bleeding you cannot directly stop. The correct treatment is not surgical intervention. You don't have a surgical suite. The correct treatment is positioning, fluid management, warmth, airway, and movement toward definitive care. Every candidate knew this academically. The question was whether their hands knew it. Marsh's hands knew it. He positioned patient 4 in the modified Trendelenburg, established a simulated IV access at the antecubital fossa. The SOCOM evaluators used a practice arm with a resistance port and ran through the abbreviated assessment in a rhythm that had no wasted syllables. He tagged the patient, marked the card, stepped back. He looked at the stopwatch on the proctor's wrist. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. He was done. Around the tent, 3 of the 12 candidates were still working. Corley was on his 3rd patient. 2 others had not yet reached their 4th. One candidate, the youngest one, maybe 22, red-haired, clearly talented, had finished not long after Marsh and was standing with his hands at his sides, breathing hard. Reardon's voice came from the far end of the tent, quiet and almost uncertain. Time of last correct patient treatment. 4:11. He looked down at his tablet, looked up at Marsh. All 4 patients triaged in correct priority order, all 4 treatments assessed as correct technique. A pause that lasted longer than it needed to. No errors flagged. Nobody said anything. The tent had gone very still. The kind of still that forms when a large group of people all revise an assumption at the same moment. Corley finished his 4th patient. He stood up. He looked across the tent at Marsh, standing by the far wall with his gloves already off and his kit already closed. Something moved across Corley's face, not quite shame, but the near neighbor of it. 4:11. Reardon said it again, softer, as if he was confirming it to himself. The young red-haired candidate, his name tape said Pellegrino, looked at Marsh and said barely above a whisper, "How?" Marsh pulled a water bottle from his cargo pocket, drank from it, capped it. He looked at Pellegrino. 45 years of getting it wrong until I stopped getting it wrong. That was all he said. What Reardon did not know, and what the tablet could not show, was what Sergeant First Class, retired, Dillon Marsh had done in the years between Landing Zone Albany and this tent in the Colorado High Desert. The full record was in a folder somewhere in the bowels of a database at Fort Sam Houston, and it would take a person with the right clearance and the right motivation to pull it. Nobody in the tent had done that. If they had, they would have found a man who served 4 tours in Vietnam as a line medic before cross-training as an 18D with the 5th Special Forces Group. They would have found a man who deployed to El Salvador in 1981 under circumstances the Army still does not discuss in detail, to the Gulf in 1991 with the 3rd Special Forces Group, where he treated 7 casualties from a vehicle ambush outside Al-Basra in under 20 minutes, with a kit that had been partially compromised when the vehicle rolled. All 7 survived. There were men walking around today, grandfathers in Ohio, a retired firefighter in Nashville, a man running a hardware store in Albuquerque, who did not know the name Dillon Marsh, but who were alive because of what his hands knew how to do. There was a silver star in the folder, 2 bronze stars with V device, a commendation from a general whose name would mean something to anyone who had studied the Gulf War, and a field report from a Special Forces team operating in Helmand Province, Afghanistan in 2003, where Marsh, already 53 years old, already the oldest man in the element by 12 years, had applied a surgical cricothyrotomy in the back of a moving vehicle using a scalpel, a ballpoint pen casing, and a piece of tubing from a hydration bladder, keeping a gunshot casualty breathing for 42 minutes until the medevac arrived. The man was alive. He lived in Portland now. He had a daughter. None of this was in the room. What was in the room was a tablet with a stopwatch app and 12 young men reassembling their understanding of what they had seen. Reardon set the tablet down on the folding table. He looked at Marsh for a long time. Sergeant Marsh. His voice had changed. The architecture of authority was still there, but something underneath had shifted. I owe you an apology. Marsh looked at him without hurry. I introduced you as an observer. Reardon's jaw tightened. I should have introduced you as the standard. Corley had moved without being aware he was moving. He was standing closer to Marsh now, not quite approaching, the way a person moves when they're working up to something. His face had lost the easy confidence. What was underneath it was younger, less formed, and more honest. "Sergeant Marsh." Corley's voice was different. The edge was entirely gone. "I said something earlier that I—" He stopped, started again. "I owe you respect I didn't give you, and I'm sorry for that." Marsh looked at him for a moment, not weighing, just looking. "You've got good hands," Marsh said. "Your placement was right. Your technique was right. You were thinking when you should have been knowing." He paused. "That's a training problem, not a talent problem. You'll get there." Corley nodded. His throat moved. Pellegrino was watching all of this from across the tent. He was young enough that he hadn't learned yet to hide what he felt on his face, and what he felt was something between awe and the particular sharpness of a lesson that lands clean and changes something permanently. He would remember this tent for the rest of his career. He would tell this story. He didn't know that yet, but he would to younger medics, in other tents, in other years, in places he couldn't yet imagine. Reardon picked up his tablet again. He scrolled to something, read it. "Sergeant Marsh, the evaluation scoring system ranks your performance at the top of the cohort for this phase." He paused. "By significant margin." Marsh pulled his kit off the table, checked that everything was returned to its correct position, zipped it, set it on his shoulder. "How long until the next scenario?" he asked. Reardon blinked. 40 minutes. Marsh nodded. "I'll be outside." He walked out of the tent into the high desert heat, and the Colorado sun hit him full in the face, and he stood there for a moment, eyes closed, hands loose at his sides. The sound of the tent behind him was the sound of young men beginning to talk again, slowly, in a different register than before. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the way he always felt after this. A quiet, interior settling like a gyroscope finding its center. The work had been done. The work had been correct. That was the whole of it. He thought briefly about Landing Zone Albany, about the grass there, the tall elephant grass that caught the last light in a particular way, orange and then gold and then gone. About a 19-year-old who did not know what he was doing, running from man to man with a kit bag, learning the job by doing it at full speed in the worst possible classroom. About the lesson that classroom taught, which was this: the hands cannot learn from a manual. The hands learn from the task, repeated, until the repetition becomes a kind of identity, until the skill is no longer something you have, but something you are. He had never stopped being that. The uniform came off. The rank retired. The body got older, slower in some ways, but the hands had kept the memory. Every suture tied, every airway placed, every tourniquet ratcheted down in the dark had been deposited somewhere below conscious thought, in a place that did not age the same way. That was what the tent hadn't known. What Reardon's tablet couldn't calculate. A great deal is lost when experience walks out the door. A great deal more is assumed gone, assumed irrelevant, assumed superseded by whatever is newer and louder and shinier. The assumption does a particular kind of damage, not to the experienced who know what they carry, to the young who miss the chance to learn from it, to all of them who end up with a poorer picture of what is possible in a human being who has had enough time and enough pressure to become something exceptional. 41 minutes later, Marsh walked back into the tent for the second scenario. He set his kit on the table. He looked at the new patient manifest. He read it once, set it face down, and this time, when Corley saw him do it, Corley nodded once and said nothing. He picked up his own manifest and read it with a different quality of attention, not faster, but deeper, more present, the way a student reads after they've seen a master at work and understood finally what reading is supposed to produce. The stopwatch was in Reardon's hand. The tent was quiet. 11 months later, a package arrived at a Veterans of Foreign Wars post in Durango, Colorado. Inside was a challenge coin, the kind Special Forces medics carry, heavy brass, 18D on one face, a caduceus on the other, and a handwritten note on paper that had been folded and refolded so many times the crease lines were almost white. The note said, "A medevac crew brought me home from the Ia Drang Valley in November 1965. I never knew who did the work before the bird got there. I know what that kind of work costs. I hope whoever reads this knows what it's worth." The coin was Marsh's. He had carried it since 1991. He had mailed it himself to no one in particular, addressed to the post, because some things deserved to be in a place where young veterans might find them. The challenge coin sat on the shelf at the VFW post in Durango for a while, next to a photograph and a coffee can full of pens. And then one evening, Pellegrino, who had looked up Marsh's record after the assessment phase, who had spent 3 hours reading a file that made his hands go cold and his chest tight with something he didn't have the vocabulary for yet, walked into that post. He was in Durango for a training rotation. He hadn't planned to go in. He walked past the door and then stopped. He went in. He saw the coin. He read the note. He stood there for a long time in the quiet of the post, holding a piece of brass that had been in a pocket at Al-Basra, at Helmand, at the Ia Drang, in every dark and terrible place where a man's hands had done the only thing that mattered. He set it back down carefully, the way you set down something that belongs to more than one person. Something that belongs, in a way, to everyone who will ever pick it up and understand what it means. Some skills are documented. Some are taught in classrooms, in PowerPoints, in the clean language of manuals written after the fact by people who were not there. And some skills live in the hands of a 63-year-old man standing in a canvas tent in the Colorado high desert, reading a manifest once and setting it face down, because once was all he ever needed. Because some men don't accumulate experience, they become it. They carry it in their hands the way other men carry photographs, quietly, constantly, always ready to show it when the moment calls, and always too humbled to bring it out when the moment doesn't. The world is quick to retire what it no longer recognizes, quick to assume that age is subtraction, that time only takes. But now and then, in a tent in the heat, with a stopwatch and a folding table, and 12 young men who thought they already knew everything, the world gets reminded of what time also builds. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. No errors flagged. If this story stayed with you, if you've known someone who was underestimated when they had already earned more than most people will ever be given, share it tonight with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so the next story finds you, and leave a comment with the word honor if this reached somewhere real.